Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Tom Tugendhat, the Conservative MP for Tunbridge Wells and the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons. Mr. Tugendhat is known by most people as a very thoughtful politician. He's a fair-minded politician and someone who is willing to speak his mind, even if that occasionally means that he is at odds with his own political party and the whips of that party. He has an unusual background. He is a British Army officer, has served with distinction in the army, but his background is perhaps slightly different from that of many of his peers. He has his first degree in theology from Bristol University and went on to do a degree in Islamic studies at Cambridge University. So we have a politician who speaks his mind, who is incredibly knowledgeable, who speaks Arabic, who knows theology, who knows military strategy, and who's also been one of the first British politicians to alert us to the fact that the role of China and the threat from China is a real one. And he's one of the founding fathers of the China Research Group in the House of Commons, or in the Conservative Party rather. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tugendhat. America now has a new president-elect, I think most people recognize. And what would that mean for us? I mean, I think the first phone call he took was from Boris Johnson, but what do you think?
Not quite. No, the first was from Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, but the first European, yes, was Prime Minister Johnson. And it's look, I think it's welcome. I mean, I think the job of the British Prime Minister is to get on with whoever is in the White House, and I'm very glad to say that we've successfully done so over the last 4 years, and indeed over the many years before that. So I think this is very welcome, and I'm very glad that President-elect Biden appears to be pulling together his administration, and let's see where this goes. It's a very exciting time.
So on the our role in the world, if I may move on to that, because we might come back to the American situation. One of the things that's going to happen now is we have left the European Union. Whether there's a deal or not a deal is another matter, and it's not necessarily your responsibility to deal with that side of things. But one of the things that is your responsibility is to deal with foreign affairs. And one of the things that struck me is now that we're going to be a more free agent in the world, will we then be able to play a role which is sort of more akin to Norway, but we might call it Norway with nukes, that we can have a sort of an independent foreign policy. We might be able to play a role in the Middle East and things like that, now that we're no longer, as it were, bound by a sort of collective responsibility with the Europeans. I'm saying, putting this in a sort of neutral way, hopefully. It might come out in a different way. So do you think we could play a role as an independent agent, as again, Norway with nukes?
Look, I think for any of us who've watched The Last Kingdom on the BBC or Vikings on Amazon Prime, the idea of having Norwegians with nukes is pretty terrifying, frankly. So I'm not quite sure it's the analogy I'd use. But
well, I'm thinking more in terms of they played a role with the Oslo peace process, for example.
Indeed. But I think the idea that we should have an independent foreign policy, I think, is one that is shared by many. I mean, it's worth stating that we shouldn't sort of imagine that the European Union has ever had a particularly successful foreign policy. It hasn't. It's got 27 member states now, many of whom have different views. It's never really tried to do very much more than attempt to coordinate, which is done through the High Representative, but it doesn't really have a single foreign policy. So yes, this will change our relationship, but I think working with the E3, as we still do, and as you rightly say, we already left the European Union, we left earlier this year. This means that we're now in a position where, yes, there is an opportunity for individual action, of course there is, but the reality is it's likely to be coordinated with our friends and allies, as it has been, and I think that's an important thing to do. And actually, Norway's independent foreign policy is also independent, but it is also coordinated with friends and allies. So it's worth being clear that democratic countries tend to work together because our interests and values are shared.
One of the areas in which we have showed a level of independence is vis-a-vis China, and you're one of I suppose the founding fathers of the China Research Group, with my good friend Tom O'Brien, of course. In there, we've been quite vocal about what's going on in Hong Kong, and I was wondering if this is one of the first examples of us having a slightly more independent foreign policy.
Look, I think our policy towards China actually sits pretty solidly within a range, and though some of us have been trying to pull it into a more sort of realistic direction, the truth is that we are also working hand in glove with others. My friend and colleague in the German Bundestag, Norbert Röttgen, and I have worked very closely together on China policy, and I don't think you could put a cigarette paper between us. And my friend David McAllister and I were just on a call with Senator Risch of the US Senate, who all three of us have the responsibility and privilege of chairing our country's, or indeed for David, of course, his organization's Foreign Affairs Committee. And that means that we find ourselves very much looking at the same questions. And I'm delighted to say that we see things very similarly. So you're right, I've been pushing for a more realistic approach to a China that has been violating many of the international principles that we have lived by for the last 70 years. But one of the things that was very interesting to me is to hear both, my US, my EU, my German, and indeed my Czech friends saying roughly the same as I do, which is, of course, we recognize, quite rightly, China has a place and needs to have authority within a changing world. Absolutely. It's a country that didn't really have its say in the international organizations that were set up in the 50s and 60s and 70s and so on. So of course it's right that we look again at those organizations. What's not right, however, is to see a country that is using its state power to bully partners like Australia or to violate international principles like intellectual property or indeed the law of the sea.
And also human rights, I suppose, is another issue.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to, I'll come back to the Australians in a second, but it strikes me as we've had different governments of different colors who've been very, very keen to, if you like, look the other way sometimes with China. When Tony Blair was Prime Minister, I remember that then a Chinese leader was driving a horse-drawn carriage, and he was awfully upset about people screaming and shouting about Tibet, and the then government wanted to shelter him from that. We then had the golden age of the David Cameron years, and then suddenly we've had not just in Britain but elsewhere people standing up to China. And I wonder what has happened. I mean, I'm just out of intellectual curiosity. Why now? Because it's not as if they just discovered that they could abuse human rights. It's not as if they've changed, or have they changed? Has there been a deterioration of Chinese policies towards human rights?
So there are two things. The first is that there has actually been a change. The direction of travel from the late 90s through to 2012, 13, 14 was, broadly speaking, I'm not going to claim that it was perfect, although there weren't human rights violations, there certainly were, but the direction appeared to be towards an admittedly more authoritarian version of capitalism, but certainly the growth of individual economic liberty that we all thought might lead to personal liberty. What changed in 2012, of course, was the elevation, the enthronement of the new emperor in Chairman Xi. And Chairman Xi and General Secretary Xi, or President Xi, depending on which of his titles you use, has demonstrated that this wasn't a one-way path. And he has cracked down on Hong Kong. He has violated in the most egregious way the rights of the Uyghurs Muslim population, and indeed violated the rights of Tibetans and Mongolians as well. We've seen a very, very big change in the way that China has been conducting itself in recent years. And I think that's what's triggered it. And then, of course, most recently, the COVID crisis has brought it to a head. Because, of course, no matter what your views about China, and no matter whether you think that China is responsible for some of the worst human rights violations in 60, 70 years, or whether you think it's simply bullying countries that are allied to us like Australia, or if you just think it's violating international agreements, the reality is all of that is brought home by something like the COVID crisis, because it demonstrates why those breaches, why that silence, why that culture of repression matters to everyone, including in places that may feel very remote, like Kent.
Yes, yes, Tunbridge Wells in China. I can see the link there, obviously. But if we don't take the case of the Australians in a way which is much more pronounced than us. I mean, several Australian governments have talked about themselves being an Asian country, and it's been very much driven towards China. They're very much dependent on China, and now it seems there's almost like a freeze, and they have said, well, if we have to give up China, so be it. Which I think is a distinction. Is distinct from the German approach, which has been, I mean, you name Herr Röttgen before, but the German government has not entirely been quite so critical. They do like to send their mercs, whereas the Australians, it seems, have been very principled about this, saying, well, we won't accept the bullying and we will take the economic hit. Is there anything that we could we do the same? Are we willing? I mean, Australia is a very close friend and partner of us. They speak the same language as part of the Commonwealth. Can we do anything to support the Australians? And will we follow them in taking sort of like a hardline approach? We can probably benefit them.
I mean, I think there are a few things that we can do. And by the way, if anybody's got the opportunity to go and buy a bottle of Australian wine and support the Australian wine economy, they're being boycotted, and I think it's a great thing to do. Apart from anything, it's nice stuff. So there you go. But there is more we can do. We can work with our Australian partners, and they're much more than allies. They're truly a brother nation, a sister nation to us. And that means that I think there's an awful lot that we have the responsibility to do, but also the capability to do. Because the reality is that for many of us, watching the bullying of Australia by China is also a reminder of what could happen to all of us.
Good. So I just again moving on again, staying within the Chinese thing, and I'll move up to another part of the world after that. We tend to talk about Hong Kong. We have a not only a vested interest in Hong Kong, we have a treaty obligation. We have with Hong Kong, and China seems to be completely ignoring us. I can see in the background we have questions there from your workplace, but we'll. I hope you're not being called.
It's on mute. Don't worry.
It's on mute. I didn't know if the bell was ringing and you had to go to a division. But another thing that's not being talked so much about here is Taiwan. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on Taiwan, because I was there last year and they said, well, during the Trump administration, they felt that they were much more vulnerable than they had hitherto been. I wonder if you think there has been a change during the Trump administration, if that will change with Biden, and if you can also talk a little bit about Taiwan and what we do with them.
Sure. So look, I mean, I think Taiwan raises some very interesting questions for all of us, because the fundamental question is clear. What are we willing to do to protect the interests of democratic and free people around the world? Now, I don't have a view on whether or not Taiwan is part of China or whether it's an independent state. It's not up to me. It's up to the people of Taiwan to decide that. And at the moment, they recognize the one country, two systems idea, concept, and that means that they argue at the moment that they themselves are part of. They are a province of China, not the PRC, but of China. Now, it's absolutely fine. It's up to them to decide. As I say, it's not up to me. But what is up to me is that when they ask to join international organizations like the World Health Organization, when they ask to have their voice heard in international fora, for example, even including things like the WTO or the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, it is up to us to decide whether or not we're willing to give them a platform and to recognize them. And I think we should. And I have to say, I think Australia has been hugely courageous on this, standing up for Taiwan's interests. And I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. And we should be supporting them too. Now, I had a very interesting series of conversations with the Taiwanese foreign minister recently, and it's quite clear that they are looking to welcome more cooperation between the United Kingdom and no doubt many other countries as well and Taiwan. And I think this is an opportunity for all of us to demonstrate what matters. Because Taiwan is not just an important partner in Southeast Asia, it's actually an important partner around the world. If you look at the way, for example, that Taiwan has been working with Somaliland, you can see examples of development support of a kind that we don't see from their neighbor, because we see actually a reinforcement of international institutions and of democratic institutions in Somaliland in a way that we simply do not see when we see Chinese support in other parts.
So I would like just to, before I move on to a number of questions that we have from the audience, I would like to ask you quite a specific question, but a broad one. We have been very interested at the Rising conference to talk about hope. And I was wondering if you could say, what is the thing that gives you hope, and what is the thing that you worry most about at the moment in a sort of almost staccato sort of way? So what is worrying you at the moment, and what gives you hope regardless of that?
So what worries me at the moment is coordination on climate change. I have to say, I think there is an urgency to this question that we haven't fully appreciated, or at least many people haven't fully appreciated until quite recently. And there is now an incredible urgency to get the COP26 conference, and indeed, by the way, many others, up and running fast, so that we actually make the changes that our world needs to see very soon. But what gives me hope? I tell you what gives me hope: free people and opportunity. We're seeing around the world a birth of liberty, the like of which we haven't seen in generations. The technological revolutions that we're seeing are changing our world in a way that I think the only similar change was the invention of the printing press 600-700 years ago, and the transformation that meant in the ideas and the sharing of ideas around the world. The Protestant Reformation is unimaginable without the printing press. And though I can't tell you what the Reformation this time is going to bring, the revolution that we are seeing is seeing a sharing of ideas, a collective consciousness, an awareness of each other, the like of which we have never seen before. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and pretend that the technological revolution is all good. There are downsides. We haven't got privacy sorted. We haven't got yet the correct response to vast amounts of disinformation, plain error, and indeed attempts to undermine us. You know, there's a lot of work to do there, but it does still give me huge hope, because the changes in technology really have allowed an explosion in innovation, the like of which we've not seen before.
Right, I will now turn to, that's actually a segue into the first question, because you mentioned the Protestant Reformation there, and we have an anonymous individual, and you have every right to be anonymous, of course, who says there can't be many MPs with a first degree in theology and a master's degree in Islamic studies. Firstly, how does your faith influence policy positions, the policy positions that you pursue? And secondly, what do you think we could be doing to improve religious literacy in the UK? But I think we'll just stay with the faith one. Does faith actually play a role in your political decisions?
My faith, me, it doesn't demand anything of anybody else. It's how I judge myself. I'm in no position. I mean, you don't require very much religious education to know that we're all sinners, and so I am not. You know, let he who is free from sin, and so on. You know, it is quite clear to me that it demands a lot of me, and it demands that I think about it. But I tell you, one of the things that it gives me in my politics is it reminds me about the dignity of all human beings. And human dignity, I think, has to be the building block of democratic order. And that's why I would argue very strongly, by the way, that Christian theology is the underpinning of real freedoms. Now, there are other theologies that do it too, but Christian theology is, for us, the underpinning of our liberties, because it's that recognition of the dignity of all human beings in our nation and indeed around the world, and also the equality of all of us before God, that I think is so important to making sure that democracy is what it should be, which is a way of resolving disputes as well as possible in conflicting societies.
Excellent. So we have another question which just slightly sort of touches upon that. My good colleague James Malcolm, Dr. James Malcolm, is asking a question where he mentions Robin Cook. Robin Cook, of course, who was, I think, dropped out of the priesthood, but become a little politician. The question is, Robin Cook famously had a vision of an ethical foreign policy, quote unquote. Do you have, you've mentioned some of the Christian things, do you have an ethical underpinning of what you consider to be the principles of the UK foreign policy? Or is that the Christian one?
It's not the way I'd put it. I'd say more simply, my view of foreign policy is the aim of the foreign policy of Her Majesty's government has to be the happiness and prosperity of the British people. And that may sound selfish, but of course the reality is that happiness and prosperity cannot be achieved unless we have peace with neighbours and friends around the world, and we have a world in which prosperity, so trade and communications, are widespread. And so I think starting on the building block, it's a bit like the principle of human dignity. If you recognise the dignity in all human beings of whatever station or status, wealth or location, you have a building block on which you can at least recognise what you're trying to achieve. And the same is true if you're seeking the prosperity and happiness of the British people, which is what I'm trying to do. And by the way, which is exactly what I expect my French and German and American, whatever opposite numbers to do, then I think it pushes us towards cooperation, because we recognise that the truth is the British people cannot be prosperous and happy and peaceful unless we are so with the French and the Germans and so on.
Do you think, I just, when you mentioned all the things about human dignity, it reminded me of the Renaissance writer Pica della Mirandola, who says that he had only learned about human dignity from the Arabs. And I was just wondering, you speak Arabic, I think you've learned that, you have a degree in Islamic studies. Do you see any sort of links there? Do you think Pica della Mirandola was right, that he had learned about human dignity from the Arabs?
I'm sure he was right, and I can go through various. Ibn Sina certainly talks about the concepts of individuality and rights, and indeed, one of the things that we value so much in democracy, and that we value certainly in our community, is the freedom of expression and freedom of freedom of conscience that is often reflected in things like freedom of religion. And though some people may not always recognize it, the truth is this has a fundamental origin in the Islamic faith, in which the Quran includes the words "La ikra fil din." There is no compulsion in religion, and to have that understanding that this isn't. I mean, I said that our underpinning is Christian because that's the history of the United Kingdom, but the truth is that the underpinning of liberty around the world is the recognition of dignity and individuality before God.
Good. So I'm just going to jump around because people have asked questions that aren't necessarily in an order. And we have Janet Vaughan, who says, have we, the UK, fulfilled our agreement that we made at the COP in Paris? Question mark. That's an admirably clear one.
As ever, we've done some and not all. And the reality is there's further to go. Look, the most important thing we've done, though, since Paris is we have begun the transformation in our own culture, in our own country. And so actually, you can pick holes, and it's perfectly legitimate to do so in our follow-on, as it were, from Paris. But I think it's more important to look at where we're going. And so I would look very clearly at the initiatives that have been started in recent years, including phasing out of carbon cars in the next 10 years, and indeed in the transformation that we're seeing around the world, around the country in terms of electric generation and wind power and so on. What I'd like to see, actually, though, is something much more radical, and I think this will be fundamentally in the interest of the British people, is I'd like to see a real revolution in hydrogen power and indeed in tidal power and many other forms of technology, because I think there is an opportunity for the UK to lead. I think we have, for various legacy reasons, one, we have an island with very, very good wind power capability from our maritime reserves, means that we can actually create green hydrogen as opposed to blue hydrogen, and we can make that out of the sea, effectively. And by doing so, we can steal a march on various other forms of energy capture and storage technology, which is, after all that hydrogen production is. at a time when, sadly, a lot of the battery technology, for various reasons, has been dominated by China, a country which is using it increasingly to leverage authority and control over others. So actually finding alternatives to traditional battery storage is about independence and prosperity of the British people, but it's also about the ability of our friends and allies to have policies abroad that suit their people and don't simply slavishly follow a master who is seeking to control them.
Which would be China in this particular case.
In this particular case.
Yes, but it strikes me, I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little bit critical now, but you say we could almost be like a world leader with renewable energy and things like that, and it is as if, you know, if you go to some of the northern European countries, they've actually been doing that for a long time, and it strikes me as we're sort of talking about it as if we are the world leader, and we might have missed a boat, and we might be just another case of sort of a world-beating system that isn't quite so world-beating.
I'm not quite sure I'd agree with you on that. There are certainly many areas in which you're right, but actually domestic hydrogen is something nobody has achieved. And Aberdeen is by a long way ahead of the pack. And the United Kingdom is therefore one of the world leaders in domestic hydrogen, replacing domestic gas. Now, how we get that into trains, where, again, by the way, we are pretty much ahead of the pack. I mean, we're not alone in that. I mean, there are other nations and other companies that are doing well too. So it's not something that we can sit by, as it were. But the reality is we are pretty much ahead on hydrogen technology in transport. And who knows where we're going to get to with aircraft, but there's certainly an indication that if the direction that we're on continues, there is a possibility. I'm being very cautious here because I don't want to promise what I can't deliver, but there is a possibility that the UK could be far ahead in terms of aviation and carbon neutral aviation.
Good. And then I'd like to sort of, again, change it because people ask questions. I'm merely the messenger, so don't shoot me at some stage. But there's also the cultural aspect of foreign policy. We are the culture capital next year in Coventry, which we're very proud of. And there's been some concern that we're not quite able to be quite as strong as we could be because we no longer have access to Europe. Do you think that cultural policy will be changed as a result of us having left the European Union? And do you think cultural diplomacy, our soft power and all of that, has a role to play?
I certainly do think our soft power has a role to play, and I do think culture is an important part of that, and the work of the British Council is part of that. But actually the work of our arts section is huge. I mean, if you want to see British culture doing well, look at the film industry, look at the computer games industry. I mean, there's a couple of people I was at school with who I really should have gone into business with, who came up with the idea for Grand Theft Auto. Now they've done rather better out of their computer game habit than I ever did. I only ever got a few points and a few trophies from within the game, so no real reward at all. They, however, have really transformed an entire industry, and that's an element where UK culture is really setting, a genuine global lead. And when you match that with, the music industry and literature, you see that the UK still remains a very powerful cultural force in the world. And I think it's absolutely wonderful that we're being challenged by K-pop, that Nigerian authors now, are winning prizes as often as British ones. In fact, some of my favorite authors are from West Africa, some of them French speaking, some of them English speaking. There is an extraordinary richness of culture that we get from around the world because of the technological innovations that we spoke about earlier. And I think that's fantastic. But I don't think we should belittle where the UK is. One of the things that always strikes me, actually, and it's a little thing, but it's one of those little things that's a tell for an indicator of other strengths. It is not unusual to see people around the world in places like China or India, or indeed all over the Middle East, with the UK flag, the Union Jack, sewn onto things or stuck onto things, whether that's a mobile phone carrier or whether that's a handbag. And it's not that these people all wish to be British or, wish to vow allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen, but it is an indicator that symbols of Britishness are seen in a neutral or positive light.
And therefore it's much more puzzling, I suppose, that a large part of the United Kingdom is now in favour of, according to the opinion polls, leaving the Europe, not the European Union, I beg your pardon, the UK. Scotland seems to be not entirely happy with the concept. Just sort of at the end of this conversation, do you have any fears about this? And can we might have soft power externally. How can we create soft power internally?
So I think that's an important question, and I would argue that there are various ways of doing it. The first is to demonstrate clearly that around the world, the United Kingdom is a respectable organization, we're a respectable nation, that it's a benefit to everybody in these islands to be part of. And I think that's about acting with integrity around the world, and acting and making sure we defend the values and interests that we share with so many others. Now, I think that's something we can do, and that demonstrates the point of union, if you like, the point of togetherness. But I think there's also things we can do internally. I think too often many politicians have spoken only about their own region, and have in that sense given strength to a nationalist idea or to a localist idea that isn't really helpful. And though nobody could be prouder of Kent than I am, the reality is Kent works as part of an integrated whole, which includes, by the way, Aberdeenshire and Perthshire, just as much as it includes Cornwall and Carmarthenshire. Our United Kingdom works because it is a delicate balance of all those things. And we need to remember that this is our country, it is ours together. And just as Betjeman's poem about the child in the pram, when he reached for the trumpet and called it his, he lost the world. There is a danger that in calling for narrow nationalism, we lose a wider identity and ability to share. And I think on that note, Mr. Tugendhat, thank you very much. That was a poetic finale, and one that reflected the best part, I would say, of our culture. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a huge honor for me and a pleasure for all of us to listen to what you had to say in an eloquent way, and in a way I think that gives us hope. Thank you very much for inviting me.